and welcome back to our morality class. Today, we're going to begin the next unit on our course, on the 6th and 9th commandments. You shall not commit adultery, and you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. That's right, this is the beginning of the unit on sexual morality. For many of you, you've either been dreading or eagerly anticipating this unit, as you've told me a few times. Either way, here we are. For many of you, this is going to be the first time you're being directed to have a mature, reflective, honest, intelligent level, academic level conversation about matters of sexuality. For most of you, growing up to this point, the topic has probably been taboo, something you just don't talk about, especially not with grown-ups, which means you've probably developed your own vocabulary of sexuality, and it's probably not a particularly mature, responsible, or reflective vocabulary of how you talk about matters of sex. And it's probably heavily informed by people who want you and have a profit motive to have you have a very, very particular and narrow-minded view of sex. In our culture, that's particularly the alliance between, say, the pornography industry and Hollywood and, film and mass media industries. So, while we are going to spend several class periods talking in detail, more than you're used to, about matters of sexuality, my rule going forward for the remainder of this unit for all of you is this. You can ask whatever questions you want. We can talk about whatever topics in this realm you want, as long as you do so with a mature, objective, accurate terminology. And we'll work out what those terms are as we go. I do not want to hear crass terms. I will not tolerate slang about various activities associated with sex. Because that shows us right away we're kind of being dragged down into the taboo instead of speaking with accuracy. So we're going to develop a language of what terms are and aren't appropriate and what they mean, and we're going to use those terms to have real discussions about something that's probably on your mind anyway. I want you to get a lot out of this unit. I want you to be able to go honest and go deep and be real. The limits of our language are there to help us do that. So, let's get into our topics of sexual morality. Today's lesson, relatively short, is just going to make one basic point that I think most people kind of miss or have never thought about, but it's going to be necessary to get this point right in order for the rest of our material going forward to make sense. And here's the very basic point. There is a way to get sex right. You can get it right. It's made to work a particular way, and when you work within that way, you're getting it correct from a sort of objective standpoint. Now, right away, when I start saying things like right and objective, a few of you probably have the walls going up of, oh no, and political language about rights and doing whatever you want and self-expression and identification, and put all that aside. You're missing my point. This is not an attack or criticism in that way. I'm going to show you from 3 different perspectives at a very, very fundamental level. Yes, there is a right way, a basic way to do sex. And what I want to show you is there's no contradiction between these 3 perspectives. We're going to look at sex from the perspective of theology, which should surprise no one, of science, which by now really shouldn't surprise most of you. You know I love scientific tangents wherever I can, go on them. And from good old-fashioned common sense. That's how we're going to proceed. And what I'm going to show you is that there's no contradiction or tension between these 3 different ways of looking at the same facts in the same situation. Good common sense, good science, good theology are all going to point us in the same direction. And when you have those 3 forces, who people strangely still seem to be at war with each other, there's no contradiction between those 3, ever, by the way. When those 3 things all sort of agree and point in the same direction, we want to pay attention and see what that direction is. So, here's how we'll proceed. I want to give you 3 different views of sex that turn out to be basically the same. We want to do it from the perspective of common sense, of science, and of theology, in that order. First, the common sense view. what happens when people have sex? Or perhaps more accurately, what's already happening with people when they start having sex? Most of the time, real life experiences. Again, try to block out a little bit of what you've seen too much of on Netflix shows and elsewhere on the internet. Normally, most people most of the time, what's going on when two people are having sex? I'm guessing most of you have some version of this thought going through your mind. Well, they love each other. Yes, good. Hopefully that's obvious, self-evident. We'll look later in this unit on why. But hopefully that's at the forefront of your mind. Yes, there's some aspect of a really intimate, really close personal love. And it's a particular kind of love. It's not the same kind of love as, say, well, no need to name other relationships here. You can think of all kinds of things it isn't. There's a particular bond of love there, and if that's missing, something's gone wrong. This much I think everyone can agree with, and not just from our culture experience, right? If you're having sex and there's no love there, something's gone wrong. Something's missing, something's incomplete, something's not sitting well with at least one of those two parties. Good. And second, someone's going to get pregnant, right? For many people your age, the main reason, unfortunately, this shouldn't be the main reason, the main reason young people avoid having sex is out of a fear of pregnancy, or that they take very, very deliberate cautionary measures to avoid pregnancy while still having sex. We'll look later at how those are problematic, but the basic idea, sex leads to babies. Again, I don't think anyone's going to dispute that, right? Please note, though, that's what happens when it goes right. Natural body, natural course of events, everyday ordinary experience with no particular deliberate interventions. Man and woman develop an intimate relationship, which leads to sex, out of which children come forth. Pretty straightforward. Any variation from that sequence presupposes, well, some very deliberate intervention or interruption or something that's not part of that natural flow coming and breaking it apart, right? It's almost self-evident from the kind of act that sex is, almost as a matter of body language, right? If this is my body language towards you, then you can tell I'm probably not pleased with you. And if this is my body language towards you, I'm paying very eager attention to you, right? You can tell a lot from the acts one performs towards another person, right? Two people walk in a room and one's got their hand on the other back. Well, that's very different than if they walk in holding hands, etc. Those body gestures, those body actions bespeak a level of honest communication. Open hands signify peace. That's why you shake hands or always wave with an open hand, right? There's no weapon there. There's no hostility there. The act of sex is a bodily act. It's a form of body language, and it communicates something very clearly. I love you. So much that I want to see the world full of little yous. Because it leads to pregnancy. That's just what it does, right? Take a second and let that sink in. Have you ever thought about it that way? Sex is an act of body language. And what it says to the other person is, I love you so much. I think the world would be a better place if there were more of you in it. Kind of cool? A little different than you're used to thinking about it? Perfectly logical, right? That's what happens. Yeah. Okay. Common sense view of sex. Two very obvious characteristics emerge. Love between two people. More than two people are going to end up being involved because more people are going to come out of this. Basic common sense. There's a very, very low-key, casual understanding of sex that most people from basically every culture in human history can kind of get on board with. Two people who love each other and whose union results in more people. Cool. Now, let's take a look from a scientific perspective. I'm going to bring in some good ideas and good observations from biology, and especially from psychology, actually, that are going to fill out this view a little bit more. We're going to take a closer look at the physical, biological nature of the human organism, and we're going to show how that fills out, agrees with, complements, completes the view of sex we've kind of already always knew, and it might be the first time we're putting such plain words to. So, first idea from biology. Ask any biologist. Go ask your biology teacher, why do mammals reproduce sexually? Or maybe a little more fair of a question, why do mammals have sex? I mean, that's the class of animal we fit into, right, as mammals. And the answer is going to be something about evolutionary advantage. Sexual reproduction, which occurs by pooling genes from multiple partners and therefore consistently varying the gene pool, has real evolutionary advantages. Sex leads to new offspring, right? That's what it's for. And the whole theory of evolution doesn't make any sense if you try to say that sex is for not reproduction instead of for reproduction. Just doesn't work. Like that's how that's evolved across animals and species. And yes, to a certain extent, humans are animals, and yes, to a certain extent, we fit that model. The function, if you will, the reason this characteristic belongs to this species is for the purpose of reproduction. Another interesting point. If you look, and again, I'm in a little over my head in terms of psychological literature and scientific literature, but I've got the main ideas here. What happens to two people in terms of their biology and their psychology, if you will, I'm going to kind of get in between those two, when they have sex, is that they undergo a process of bonding. Hormonally, emotionally, psychologically, certain chemicals are released in the brain, and again, this is where we're getting a little beyond vocabulary that I know well, which cause them to bond together. They form a strong social attachment, which brings them to stay together, to nest or live together, right? That happens at a biological level. The act of having sex with another person brings you into such a relationship with them as a function of your own brain chemistry, as a function of your own biology, that you want to stay with them, that you are bound to them, and they are bound to you. You connect. This is, again, a sort of very, very unromantic scientific look at the part where two people love each other. They're bound together. And what's further, extensive studies of how this bonding through the act of sex happens in the brain shows something a little bit alarming. If you bond with a person and then break that bond, you are less and less able to form the new bond. It won't be as strong, it won't form as well. And then if you break that apart, forming another new bond within another person, you still will not bond as well. It gets harder and harder every time, as if you were taking, say, two pieces of tape and putting them together and then ripping them apart. The stickum wears off. And eventually they can't actually bond effectively. That's an interesting scientific argument, psychological argument for human monogamy as a species, before we even get into any social concerns of marriage and the permanence thereof, etc. You are designed, or at least the way your body functions, is to bind you to another person, and ideally to stay bound to that person by the act of sex. So let's take a look at what our very brief scientific overview says. Sex is reproductive, and it is psychologically, biologically, socially binding in a certain way. Our common sense view said, love and babies, right? And now we're sort of bringing in good, hard observation of the functions of the human body, and what do we get? Basically the same thing. Bound together for purposes of reproduction. I wonder what happens when we bring good theology into the mix. We knew this is where this was going, right? Genesis chapter 1, starting at verse 26. And the Lord said, "Let us make man to our image and likeness, and let him have dominion over the fishes of the sea, the fowls of the air, and the beasts, and the whole earth, and every creeping creature that moves upon the earth. And, verse 27 now, this is the big one. And God created man to his own image. To the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. Verse 28. And God blessed them, saying, Increase and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fishes of the sea and the fowls of the air and all living creatures that move upon the earth. Skipping ahead to verse 31. And God saw all the things that he had made, and they were very good. Here's the theological idea. Very deep, very sort of meta about the nature of the universe. God says, let us, plural, make humanity in our plural image. Now, we looked at this very briefly when we studied Genesis chapter 1 together in the beginning of the year, but I want to go back and reiterate this point. God is not one person, although he is one God. This is the idea of the Trinity, the great mystery that I'm sure you studied at length in your previous theology classes, so which point I will not belabor at length here. There are three persons who constitute one God. There's both difference and sameness in who and what God is. Might be a really basic summary. We're going to go a tiny bit deeper. I want to look at the procession of the persons within the Trinity, and then I want to look back at male and female. God, as Father, gives rise to the Son, second person of the Trinity, the one who becomes man, who we call Jesus, right? And the Son is the image of the God. He is the reflection of the Father. So the first relationship is between Father and Son, who is his reflection, his image. And the mutual love between them, the way in which the Father reflects the Son, and the way in which the Father is reflected by the Son, gives rise to a whole new person, the Spirit. The Holy Spirit. One person, reflected in his image, such that their mutual love gives rise to a whole new person. Plural. Let us make man and woman in our image. Man, the male, is not sufficient, I argue, to be in God's image. Sufficient perhaps to be in the image of Jesus, one person of the Trinity, but not of the full Trinity of God. Why? God isn't a person, he's a relationship. And a fruitful one that gives rise not just to new life of the, well, not new life, but a third person of the same kind as the two persons, but also almost as an overflow of this mutual love to the whole of the created universe, to time and space as you and I know it and experience it. Persons in a state of mutual love that gives rise to new life. That's what God is. That's who God is. Now look at the male and female of Genesis 1, verses 26 and 27. The male is not sufficient to be God's image. The female is not sufficient to be God's image. But when they come together they are in God's image. Why? Because together they are two persons in relationship whose mutual love gives rise to a third person of the same type that they are. Mutual love. Reproduction. It's the same thing a quick glance at science told us, and the same thing that a common sense view told us. But now it's suffused with the glory of God himself as sort of this infinite amount of love and splendor and glory, right? To whom all praise is due. We get to opt into that by marriage, by sex. The fact that human beings come together in pairs to reproduce through the act of sex resembles God himself. It's an icon of who and what God is. It's not the same as, it's not identical to, it's not equal to, we don't need to get into those questions. But it's got something to do with who God is and how he is. Mutual love between a person who is the image and reflection of the other, giving rise to a third person. This goes even deeper, by the way, if we start looking at Genesis chapter 2, where God makes the man, and then out of the man fashions what amounts to the inverse of the man from his rib, the image, right? The mirror image, sort of, with partial differences and partial similarities, but clearly made out of the same stuff. The one person, the second person, who give rise to a third person. The Son who is the image of the Father. There's a real deep language of the order of creation resembling the order of procession of the Trinity. And it's all based on this very, very basic, very, very common sense idea. Mutual love, new life. They go together. So, everything we've said so far, I think, gives us a very strong basis on which to make one moral claim about human sexual activity. Just one. We'll go into way more nuanced and way more detailed and way more complex claims later. For now, I want to say the three ways we've looked at sex so far all argue for one pretty obvious point about sex. And it's that you're supposed to have one partner permanently. I'm going to say that that's not what the church teaches, which is usually a cop-out people use when they want to say that the church teaches that, but they don't want to actually bound by it. So they stop saying Jesus says or common sense says. They say the church says, as if the church is some kind of boogeyman. Watch out when you find yourself saying that. Anyway, sorry for the side rant. I want to show you that as a function of good common sense and good science and good theology, all taken together, the relationship between the mutually loving, procreating man and woman needs to be permanent. First, common sense. What do we talk about in common sense? The body language of love, right? Okay, your relationship towards another person is such that your body language physically says through the act you perform, I love you so much, the world will be a better place with more of you in it. And we're going to make more of you to fill the world with, right? We're going to make little yous. There's an incumbent responsibility there, isn't there? See, if you're going to go creating new people, you kind of have to take care of them. Help them grow up. Raise them. Make sure they actually turn out like the person you admire so much you want them to be. That takes time. And it takes not just time in terms of years, but time in terms of exclusivity and focus. You can't be a father to 20 kids from 10 different women. It doesn't work. You can't give them the time and attention and love they deserve. And you can't be a father if you leave one woman to go to another woman, and then a few years later to another woman. How many years does it take before this new life that you've created is really, really viable on its own? 20-something years. Yeah, it's a 20-something year commitment. Right? I mean, you guys know, 18, you become a legal adult, whatever that means. But are you really entirely independent? Not in this economy. Probably you feel the need to go to college to get a job, maybe move back in with mom and dad for a little while, and then to seek their advice and get support from them, even if you're out on your own, as you figure out adult living and things like, do you buy a house right away, or do you rent for a while? And who do you marry, and what sort of career do you pursue? And do you go in for another degree to pursue the career, etc.? All those questions, your parents still play a fundamental role of support in getting you through those difficult decisions in the early stages of adulthood. We talked about that back in our lesson on mutual obligations. So yeah, the body language of sex isn't just, I love you so much that I want there to be more of you in the world. It's, I love you so much I want there to be more of you in the world, and I'm willing to put down the next 25 years as a down payment to make sure that happens and happens correctly. That's what being responsible would entail. So yes, if your having sex with someone in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, say, then you've just committed your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and maybe into your 70s, raising this person, these new people with this person. That's basically permanent. That just kind of adds up in a common sense way. And for the same reasons, it needs to be exclusive. We're talking about a dedication and time of focus. Let's review this idea from our scientific perspective. We looked at two things. We looked at evolutionary biological advantage of sexual reproduction, and we looked at the psychological bounding together that goes on between two people who are having sex. Again, both of these argue for a permanence and an exclusivity of that relationship. It needs to be permanent because you're not made to bond and unbond, bond and unbond, bond and unbond, either with one person or with others. You're meant, by the way your body bonds socially and chemically and hormonally to another person, to stay with them. And again, the exclusivity won't work because every time you change, the exclusivity needs to be there. Polygamy, as it will, won't work because every time you change sexual partners, that social bonding is going to be less effective. And if the social bonding isn't there, there's less incentive for both parents to stay and participate in raising of the children. If the children aren't well reared, well prepared for, don't survive particularly well, then the evolutionary advantage isn't there. then you're back to doing what turtles and reptiles do, which is just make lots and lots and lots of babies that have low odds of success instead of carefully rearing one or two or three or so, at a time, with the idea of growing them up fully. The way your body bonds and the way the way sexual reproduction works from a scientific perspective also argue for at least some idea that you should be with one partner for the duration of the whole sexual reproduction and child rearing phase. That's what's going to work best with your body, the way it's evolved, the way it's designed. From the perspective of theology, we looked at sexual reproduction of the act of a man and woman coming together as an icon of the Trinity, of the persons of God himself, from outside of time and space, causing time and space and everything within it. And you're going to break that up? Right away, it should be obvious. There's no divorce in God. There's no ripping apart the persons of the Trinity. They don't get together sometimes and then break off. That's not who and what God is. They're not separate from one another in that way. They share one essence. You can't imagine one. Literally, you cannot imagine one without the other if you have them right. So what do we call this relationship of a man and a woman who love each other so much that they not only make kids, but raise them well and bind together socially, emotionally, to the point that you can't imagine one without the other? There's a word for that. It's marriage. Marriage is fundamentally human in that particular way. Exclusive. Male, female, procreative. That's what's meant by marriage. That's what histories and societies have meant by marriage going way back across cultures, across societies. That's why I find it a little silly, if you'll forgive me, for thinking that, say, something like the United States Supreme Court, which is really powerful in our tiny little country, in our tiny little slice of history of barely 300 years old, but which in the whole scope of human history is like an insignificant little blip, just like any one other collection of 9 people in a country, thinks that it can define marriage. I'm sorry, the Supreme Court doesn't get to pull rank on marriage. Marriage was here before the Supreme Court, before the country, and before the Constitution, and it's going to be around long after this country fades away. And its principles are so fundamentally logical and basic to the human experience. The exclusivity and permanence of marriage are kind of self-evident once you start talking honestly about what sex is and what its results are. Yeah. And every time we use the word marriage, this is what we mean. The man and woman who come together in mutual love to create new life out of their mutual love. You don't have to make a separate case for marriage. Marriage and sex are so obvious from one another that most cultures haven't even felt the need to spell out what I'm telling you guys. Ours does, because ours is a little loopy on these topics. Yeah. body language, biology, theology, they're all going to kind of talk to the same points here. The way to get sex right, the way to do sex correctly in the context of the whole human experience is to do it the way people have been doing it all along. In a exclusive and permanent relationship of mutual love that gives rise to new people. What we're going to look at in later lessons is how various ways of getting it wrong lead to various consequences and various problems and why they're problematic. We'll look at all that. That's where things might get a little more controversial. But here, like, this should be pretty open and shut. There very clearly is one ideal here, and it's very clearly how we're designed. Or at least, if you have some weird objection to the idea that we are designed, to how we've evolved. Fine. Mutual love, new life, with implications towards exclusive and permanent. Duh. Right? Yeah. And one last point, lest we forget. What we're talking about is sexual morality. Please notice, at no point have I made up rules or cited a particular authoritarian source that says thou shalt or thou shalt not, or there's a criminal penalty or a fine or blah, blah, blah. None of that. We're just talking about trying to get it right. Our definition for morality is the science of human happiness. What I'm telling you is that this basic level, this simple, fundamental, universal human understanding is what leads to happiness, to deep human flourishing, to whole societies of happy families, as we talked about back in the Fourth Commandment. Yeah. It's basic, simple, it's universally human. And we're talking about what actually succeeds in making people happy. And we know this. We've always known this. Sex and marriage. It's good news. They go together. I'm sure you have questions. I suspect if you have objections, I eagerly look forward to hearing them. I really want to hear what you guys have to say. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. God bless.